More reaction on the land reform briefing. Professor Ruth Hall from the University of the Western Cape joins me now from Zoom. Thank you very much, Professor Hall, for your time. So that Interministerial Committee on Land Reform, the issues addressed today very much condensed not only to the expropriation bill, but to expropriation without compensation, or as it's being phrased today, expropriation with nil compensation. It's been described by Land Reform Minister Toko Didiza as a very moderate bill. Would you agree?
Absolutely. It's a very moderate bill. It's, I mean, what has been done is that government has now finally come through and said, yes, we are going to bring our expropriation law in line with the Constitution as it currently is. And as one of the journalists pointed out in the briefing, if you're saying that this bill has already got approval as being constitutional, the state law advisors have said, go ahead, you can publish it, then what's the purpose of changing the Constitution? So I think what we can see here is a bill that says government can expropriate property, and when it expropriates, the courts can decide whether or not compensation should be paid. So I think that the key issue here is not the issue around the expropriation, whether or not it goes ahead, but the question of who determines the compensation. So one of the key arguments and division points within the ANC has been, should this power rest with the minister or with the courts? And the Presidential Advisory Panel on Land Reform and Agriculture that I was on felt very strongly that, that in order not to be held up by the courts, government needs to say, here's how we're going to approach compensation. And the minister should be able to make an offer of compensation. And there should always be judicial review. But we shouldn't leave this all up to the courts. I worry that this approach that's been adopted will mean long delays in court and actually not expediting land reform. I think that that's where we are at.
Why do you think then the decision has been made to leave those powers or to let those powers rest with the judicial system?
Well, I think that what we know is that 2.5 years ago, Parliament took this vote to look into constitutional amendment. The ANC at the time was very much on the back foot and needing to respond to the call by the EFF for constitutional amendment. And I think ever since then, the question around what is expropriation without compensation, the EFF actually wants to nationalize all land. The ANC is proposing a case-by-case expropriation of particular parcels of land and saying we will compensate in some cases and not in others. I think that the real the pressure has been on the ANC in the past 2 years to show South African business investors, international business, that there will be a judicial process on each case. I think that what the big mistake is that I'm hearing right now is that the government is not saying, here's how we're going to approach this issue. So I think what is needed actually from government is not so much the legal framework, but policy. We don't have policy where government says, here is the land that we want to expropriate. This is what we're going to do. And here's how we're going to approach compensation. That then can get tested in the courts. But what you don't want is a case-by-case basis in the courts. And I think that we really are in a position where we're not moving forward very substantially. I worry that many of the recommendations that have come out of these long processes of discussion around land reform are all being ignored, while only the one issue, which is the expropriation law, is being attended to.
Oh, that was going to be my next question, is that land reform is such a broad discussion and there's such a huge cross-section of very divisive issues that fall under land reform, and our focus seems to be very narrowly on expropriation without compensation. Do you think that issue has been hijacked to create political division specifically?
Well, I think that in a sense it's a sign that the land issue is not central to politics, that it does get sort of brought out and then ignored and so on. But I think that there are many issues that were put on the table by the Presidential Advisory Panel. We said, in fact, it's not clear where we're going with land reform. We need a new white paper process. We need to fix the Land Claims Court and reform it. It has no permanent judges. It doesn't function properly. In the announcement for today's media briefing, we understood that Minister Ronald Lamola, Minister of Justice, would also be speaking. It's a pity he didn't speak. We would want to know, Is there a process to reform that? We know there's a bill process. How are we going to fix the court? Are we fixing the process so that all the old land claims can move ahead now? Is the Land Claims Commission being fixed? Do we have a new approach to dealing with climate change and water rights within land reform? You know, there's a whole host of other issues, including an urban land reform policy that we called for well over a year ago. And there hasn't really been advance on that. And I think if there's one thing that the coronavirus lockdown has shown us is that there is enormous pressure for land. And it's not all from people who want to become commercial farmers. It's also for well-located land for affordable housing in and around the cities. And we don't have a clear policy framework for that. So I feel like what's most important now is for us as a society to say to the Interministerial Committee on Land Reform, you've been given this mandate 2 years ago, you've been given guidance by a presidential advisory panel with very wide-ranging recommendations. Your report on the expropriation bill is well and good. It's noted. The issue will be debated in Parliament, but actually we need a mechanism for accountability where the Interministerial Committee says, here are all the recommendations, these are the ones we will pursue, these ones we will not, and here are our timeframes, and here is how we will account to you. And I feel that that is actually a very concrete thing that the Interministerial Committee can and should do to keep us in the loop. This issue of land reform is too often dealt with in vague, general ways with promises that get deferred. And yet there's some specific recommendations with timeframes that were made, and I think the committee still needs to account for those.
Well, thank you very much. I'm hearing once again that implementation comes up so often, and that's where our government is lacking. Thank you very much for speaking to us, Professor Ruth Hall from the University of the Western Cape.